I am Arthur Vance. For 20 years, I was the lead thermal engineer at Aegis Tech, a man who lived for the hum of a perfectly cooled server room. I poured my life into the Vance core, a cooling system that revolutionized data centers across the country. But my boss, Sterling Thorne, was a man who saw people as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. He wanted to sell the company for a massive profit, and my 20-year pension and stock options were standing in his way. He framed me for corporate espionage, planting fake emails on my computer that suggested I was selling secrets to our biggest competitor. I was escorted out of the building with nothing but a cardboard box and a reputation in tatters. I spent months trying to find work, but Sterling had poisoned the well. Eventually, I lost my home and found myself living in a small tent city under the interstate. That is where I built the scrap siphon. While Sterling sat in his glass office, I was digging through dumpsters behind appliance stores. I used old microwave magnets, discarded copper wiring, and laptop batteries that people had thrown away as junk. The scrap siphon was a crude-looking box, but it was a masterpiece of resonance induction. It pulled wasted electromagnetic energy right out of the air and turned it into clean, free electricity for everyone in the camp. The blue spark jumped from the copper coil to the rusted battery terminal, and for a split second, the dark corners of my nylon tent glowed like a midday sun. The smell of ozone filled my lungs, sharp and electric, a scent I had not smelled since I had my own high-tech lab and $1 million budget. My fingers were cracked from the winter wind and stained with the grease of a dozen discarded engines, but as that light flickered, I knew the laws of physics did not care if I was wearing a tuxedo or a tattered coat. Sterling Thorne thought he had buried me, but he did not realize I was a seed. The world saw a homeless man, but I saw a miracle. Subscribe and comment where you are watching from, because the person sleeping in a shelter was about to change everything. I remember the hum of the server room at Aegis Tech. To most people, it was just white noise, a loud, constant drone that made your ears ring. To me, it was a symphony. I had spent 20 years perfecting the Vance core, the cooling system that kept the world's data from melting down. I knew the personality of every fan and the rhythm of every thermal cycle. I walked those halls with a sense of pride that only comes from decades of hard work and loyalty. I was not just an employee. I was the architect of the company's success. Or at least, that is what I told myself every morning as I swiped my badge and felt that little beep of belonging. Sterling Thorne was a different breed. He came in 5 years ago with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a suit that cost more than my first car. He talked about synergy and disruption, words that sounded fancy, but did not mean much when a pipe burst or a server overheated. He did not see the people who built the machines. He saw assets to be squeezed. I should have seen it coming when he started asking for my private security codes under the guise of a system-wide audit. I trusted him because I trusted the company. That was my first mistake. The day it happened was a Tuesday. It was raining, a gray, miserable drizzle that clung to the windows of my office. Sterling called me into the boardroom. He was not alone. 2 men in dark suits stood by the door, and a human resources representative sat at the table with a folder that looked far too thick. Sterling did not offer me a seat. He did not even look me in the eye. He just pushed a stack of papers toward me. They were emails, or at least they looked like emails. They were addressed to our biggest competitor, and they contained the proprietary schematics for the next generation of the Vance core. My name was at the bottom of every single one. My private security signature was stamped on every attachment. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I told him it was a mistake. I told him I had never seen these before. I looked at the dates and realized I was out of town at a conference when half of these were sent, but Sterling just shook his head, putting on a show of being deeply disappointed. He told me they had tracked the login to my home computer. He told me the board was considering legal action, but if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and walked away quietly, they would not call the police. He was taking my pension, my stock options, and my 20 years of service in exchange for my freedom. It was a mugging in a mahogany room. I walked out of that building 10 minutes later with a single cardboard box. It held a stapler, a framed photo of my late wife, and a small brass wrench I had used since my first day. The security guards walked me all the way to the sidewalk. I stood there in the rain, watching the Aegis Tech logo glow on the side of the skyscraper. I did not have a lawyer. I did not have a backup plan. I had a reputation that was currently being shredded in every trade magazine in the industry. Sterling had poisoned the well so thoroughly that I could not even get an interview for a junior technician job at a local repair shop. Month by month, the life I had built crumbled. The mortgage went unpaid. The car was repossessed. My friends, or the people I thought were my friends, stopped answering my calls. It is funny how quickly people disappear when they think your failure might be contagious. By the end of the year, I was sitting on a park bench with everything I owned in a backpack. The weight of the world felt heavy, but the weight of the injustice felt heavier. I ended up in a small community of tents tucked under the massive concrete pillars of the interstate. People call it an eyesore, but to me, it was the only place left that did not require a background check. In the camp, I met people who had been broken by the same kind of greed that ruined me. There was Sarah, a former nurse who lost everything to medical bills, and Leo, a veteran who just could not find his footing. We sat around a small fire made of scrap wood, shivering as the winter air began to bite. That is when I saw it. A discarded microwave sitting in a pile of junk near the highway off-ramp. Most people saw a piece of trash. I saw a high-voltage transformer and a magnetron. I saw a way to bring warmth to a place that had been left in the dark. I started scavenging. I did not have a lab anymore, but I had the entire city's waste as my inventory. I found old laptop batteries that still held a ghost of a charge. I found copper wiring stripped from abandoned construction sites. I found magnets in old speakers. My neighbors thought I was losing my mind, watching me tinker with wires and bits of metal by the light of a flickering candle. But I was not just building a heater. I was remembering who I was. I was Arthur Vance, and I did not need a skyscraper to change the world. The idea for the scrap siphon came to me when I realized how much energy was just floating around us. Cell towers, radio waves, the massive power lines running right over our heads. The air was thick with wasted electromagnetic frequency. I just needed a way to catch it. I spent weeks winding copper coils by hand, my fingers bleeding and cold. I used a discarded plastic bucket as the housing. It looked like a pile of garbage, but inside, it was a masterpiece of resonance induction. One night, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wind was howling through the concrete pillars, I called Sarah and Leo over to my tent. They looked exhausted, their faces pale from the cold. I took the two main leads of my contraption and prepared to connect them. If I was wrong, I would have just wasted a month of my life on a toy. If I was right, the rules of the game were about to change forever. I reached out, my hand trembling, and brought the wires together. The air began to hum, a low, vibrant sound that vibrated in my teeth. And then, the first spark flew. I looked at the small light bulb I had salvaged from a car's blinker, and I waited for the miracle. The light bulb did not just flicker. It erupted into a steady, brilliant glow that turned the inside of my tent into a sanctuary of gold. Sarah gasped, reaching out a hand to feel the heat radiating from the small coil I had attached to a piece of sheet metal. For the first time in months, we were not just surviving. We were thriving. But as the warmth filled the space, I heard a sound from the road above. A long black limousine was slowing down, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh street lights. I knew that car. I knew the man inside. And I knew that the Vance cores at Aegis Tech were finally starting to fail. Sterling Thorne was coming for me, but he had no idea that the man he left in the mud was now holding the power of the sun in a plastic bucket. I watched the limousine door begin to open, and I realized that my quiet life of scavenging was over. The man who stole my past was about to find out that I held his entire future in my hands. I remember the way the air used to feel inside the main server room at Aegis Tech. It was a crisp, clean chill, exactly 68 degrees, maintained by the very system I had spent half my life building. To most people, that room was just a loud, freezing warehouse full of blinking lights and black boxes. But to me, it was a cathedral. I was the lead thermal engineer, the man who made sure the heart of the digital world didn't overheat and die. I loved the hum of the fans and the steady vibration of the floor beneath my feet. It was the sound of a job well done. For 20 years, I gave that company everything. I missed birthdays, I worked through holidays, and I stayed late into the night just to make sure the Vance score was perfect. I thought I was part of a family. I thought loyalty meant something in this world. Sterling Thorne was the man who taught me how wrong I was. Sterling came into the company like a shark in a silk suit. He had these bright, white teeth and a way of talking that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room, right up until the moment he decided you were in his way. He didn't care about the engineering or the people who actually did the work. He cared about the stock price and the upcoming merger with a massive global conglomerate. The problem for Sterling was my contract. I had been there so long that my pension and my stock options were worth a small fortune. If he sold the company with me on the payroll, it would cost him millions. I was a line item on a balance sheet that he wanted to erase. The morning it all fell apart started like any other Tuesday. I had my coffee in my favorite chipped mug, the one my wife gave me before she passed away. I walked through the lobby, nodding to the security guards who had known me for 2 decades. I felt good. We had just finished the stress tests on the new liquid cooling modules, and the results were better than I ever dreamed. But when I reached my office, the door was already open. 2 men I didn't recognize were standing there, and my computer was gone. Before I could even ask what was happening, Sterling's assistant appeared and told me I was needed in the boardroom immediately. When I walked in, the air felt different. It wasn't the clean, cool air of my lab. It was heavy and stagnant. Sterling was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, looking down at a stack of papers. Beside him sat a woman from Human Resources and a man I recognized as the company's lead investigator. Nobody told me to sit down. "Arthur, we have a very serious problem," Sterling said. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was much worse. He pushed a folder toward me. Inside were printouts of emails that looked like they had been sent from my private account. They were addressed to our biggest competitor in Europe. They contained the full schematics for the Vance core, along with a request for a $5 million wire transfer. My heart dropped into my stomach. I told him it was a lie. I told him I had never seen those emails in my life. I looked at the timestamps and realized I was in the middle of a dental surgery when one of them was supposedly sent. But Sterling didn't want to hear about my dentist. He told me they had tracked the IP address to my home network. He told me they found a hidden folder on my work laptop containing the same offshore bank account information mentioned in the emails. It was a perfect frame job. He had used my own security codes, the ones I had given him months ago during a routine audit, to plant every single piece of evidence. He knew I didn't have the money to fight a multi-million-dollar corporation in court for the next 10 years. He gave me a choice. I could sign a paper saying I was resigning for personal reasons, forfeit all my stock and pension, and walk away quietly. Or he would call the police right then and there. I looked at the HR woman, someone I had eaten lunch with for years, and she wouldn't even meet my eyes. That was the moment I realized the world I knew was gone. I signed the papers because I was terrified. I didn't have anyone left to help me. And the thought of spending my final years in a prison cell for a crime I didn't commit was too much to bear. They gave me 10 minutes to pack a single box. The security guards who used to smile at me now stood on either side of me, their hands on their belts, as if I were a common thief. I walked out of that building into a cold, gray rain, holding a cardboard box that contained my entire life. The months that followed were a slow-motion car crash. Sterling didn't just fire me, he made sure I was radioactive. Every time I applied for a job, the interview would go great until they did a background check or called for a reference. I don't know what Sterling told them, but the tone always changed. The friendly smiles would vanish, and I'd get a generic email a day later saying they had decided to go in a different direction. My savings started to dry up. The mortgage on the house I had lived in for 30 years became a mountain I couldn't climb. I tried to sell my furniture, my tools, and even my old engineering books just to keep the lights on. But eventually, the bank stopped sending letters and started sending men with locks. I remember the day the sheriff arrived. He was a young guy, looked like he wasn't even 30. He was polite, but he had a job to do. He stood there while I put the last of my things into a backpack. I walked down the driveway and didn't look back. I spent a few weeks in a cheap motel until the last of my cash was gone. Then I spent a few nights in my car until it was repossessed while I was sleeping in a park. That brings me to my first night on the street. It's a feeling you can't really describe to someone who hasn't been there. It's not just the cold, though the cold is a physical weight that never leaves you. It's the invisibility. People walk past you and look through you as if you're a ghost. I ended up under the interstate bridge, a place where the concrete pillars are the size of ancient trees. The ground was damp and smelled like old exhaust and wet cardboard. I found a spot near a group of people who looked just as tired as I was. I sat down on a piece of flattened shipping crate and pulled my thin coat tight around my shoulders. The roar of the traffic above me was a constant, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of a city that didn't want me anymore. I looked at my hands, the hands that had designed the most advanced cooling systems in the country, and they were shaking from the chill. I had nothing, no home, no reputation, and no future. As I watched the sun go down behind the skyline of the city where I used to be a respected man, I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. But then, my eyes landed on a pile of junk about 20 feet away. There was a broken microwave, a tangled mess of copper wire, and an old car battery that someone had dumped. I stared at that pile of trash for a long time. In the darkness, most people would see a graveyard of useless things. But as the first stars began to peek through the smog, my engineer's brain started to hum again. I didn't have a lab, and I didn't have a paycheck, but the laws of physics were still the same under a bridge as they were in a skyscraper. Sterling Thorne thought he had taken everything from me, but he had forgotten one thing. He had left me with my mind. And as the wind picked up, I realized that the bridge wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a very long, very cold education for the man who thought he could throw me away. I reached out and picked up a piece of the copper wire, feeling the familiar weight of it in my palm. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to build something they never saw coming. The first thing you learn when you live under a bridge is that the world never really stops moving. It just moves on top of you. Above my head, thousands of cars were rushing to important meetings and warm homes, their tires making a steady thumping sound against the expansion joints of the highway. Down here, in the shadows, time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. I sat on my crate, shivering in a coat that had seen better decades, and looked at the pile of garbage I had collected over the last week. To anyone else, it was a heap of broken dreams and discarded plastic. To me, it was the most sophisticated laboratory in the city. I didn't have a clean room or a laser cutter anymore, but I had something better. I had a reason to fight back. I spent my mornings scavenging. It is amazing what people throw away when they think something is broken. I found an old microwave oven sitting next to a dumpster behind an appliance store. Most people see a microwave and think of popcorn, but an engineer sees a high-voltage transformer and a beautiful set of magnets. I dragged that heavy beast back to my spot under the bridge, my breath coming in ragged gasps in the cold air. I didn't have a screwdriver, so I used the edge of a flattened soda can and a lot of patience to get the casing off. When I finally saw the copper coils inside, I felt a spark of joy I hadn't felt since the day I first designed the Vance core. It was like seeing an old friend in a crowd of strangers. My workspace was a flat piece of plywood I had propped up on 4 cinder blocks. I kept it as clean as I could, sweeping away the grit and the soot from the highway every hour. I had a pair of rusty pliers I found in a gutter, and a multi-tool that was missing half its blades. But they were enough. I spent hours sitting there, unraveling the copper wire from the transformer. I had to be careful. If I nicked the insulation, the whole thing would short out. I wrapped the wire around my fingers, smoothing out the kinks, feeling the cool metal against my cracked skin. My hands were stained with grease and dirt. But they were steady. Sterling Thorne had taken my house and my reputation. But he couldn't take the way my brain worked. He couldn't take the 20 years of physics I carried in my head. One afternoon, a man named Leo walked over to my little corner. Leo had been under the bridge a lot longer than I had. He was a tall, thin man with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world twice over. He stood there for a long time, watching me wind a coil of wire around a plastic pickle bucket I had washed out in a nearby puddle. He didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against a concrete pillar and chewed on a piece of dry grass. After a while, he cleared his throat. "You planning on catching a giant fish with that bucket, Arthur?" he asked. His voice was gravelly but kind. I looked up and gave him a small smile. "No, Leo. I am planning on catching something much smaller than a fish. I am catching the air." Leo shook his head and sat down on the dirt. "You have been playing with that junk for 3 days. People are starting to think you have a fever. You should be looking for wood for the fire tonight. It is going to be a cold one." I knew he was right about the cold, but I couldn't stop. I told him that if this worked, we wouldn't need to worry about wood anymore. I explained to him, in the simplest way I could, that the air all around us was full of energy. The cell towers, the radio stations, the power lines running just 50 feet away, they were all leaking electricity into the sky. I was building a net to catch it. Leo just stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. He patted me on the shoulder and told me to stay warm. Then he walked back to his own tent. I could tell he didn't believe me, but that was okay. I had spent my whole life proving people wrong. I kept working. I needed magnets, so I spent an entire day digging through a pile of discarded electronics at the local scrapyard until I found 4 old stereo speakers. I pried the magnets off the back with a piece of rebar. They were strong, the kind that could pinch your skin if you weren't careful. I arranged them in a specific pattern inside the bucket, creating a magnetic field that would resonate with the frequencies in the air. It was a delicate balance. If the magnets were even a fraction of an inch off, the resonance would collapse. I used bits of chewing gum I found under park benches to hold them in place temporarily. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't what they taught in engineering school, but it was functional. The hardest part was the capacitor. I needed a way to store the tiny bits of energy I was catching until there was enough to actually do something. I made one out of 2 sheets of aluminum foil I found in a discarded fast food bag and a piece of plastic wrap. I layered them together, rolling them tightly into a cylinder. It looked like a silver burrito, but in the world of physics, it was a storage tank. By the time the sun started to go down on the 4th day, my machine was finished. It sat there on my plywood table, a pickle bucket wrapped in copper wire, stuffed with speaker magnets and foil, with 2 ragged wires sticking out of the top. It looked like a child's science project that had gone horribly wrong. I felt a strange sense of calm as the shadows grew long. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a small light bulb I had salvaged from the glove box of a wrecked car in the impound lot. It was a tiny thing, no bigger than a marble. I sat cross-legged on the ground, the cold dampness of the earth seeping into my bones. My heart was thumping in my chest, a rhythmic beat that matched the cars overhead. I knew this was the moment. If I was wrong, I was just a crazy old man playing with trash in the dark. If I was right, everything was about to change. I took the first wire and twisted it around the base of the little bulb. My fingers were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the moment. I looked around the camp. Most people were huddled in their tents or sitting around the small, flickering fire Leo had started. Nobody was looking at me. I was just another shadow in the dark. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a second, and touched the second wire to the tip of the bulb. At first, nothing happened. The world stayed dark. I felt a wave of disappointment wash over me, a heavy, crushing feeling that made me want to lay down and give up. But then I heard it. A low, soft hum. It was so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it. It was the sound of 1,000 invisible bees vibrating inside the bucket. The copper wire began to glow with a faint blue static. And then, suddenly, the little bulb in my hand didn't just light up. It shone. It was a bright, steady, golden light that cut through the gloom like a knife. I gasped, my eyes widening as the light reflected off the concrete pillars around me. It wasn't a flicker or a spark. It was real, usable power, pulled right out of the thin, cold air. I held the bulb up, and the light spilled across the dirt, illuminating the faces of my neighbors as they turned to look. I saw Leo stand up, his jaw dropping as he stared at the glowing marble in my hand. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the man who had brought the sun under the bridge. But as I looked at the light, I realized that if I could power a bulb, I could power a heater. And if I could power a heater, I could build something that would make Sterling Thorne's entire empire look like a candle in a hurricane. I smiled, and for the first time in months, I wasn't cold at all. I was just getting started. The morning light under the bridge is never really bright. It is a hazy gray filter that makes everything look like an old photograph found in a dusty attic. I was sitting there on my crate, polishing a length of copper wire with a piece of an old t-shirt. Word had gotten out among the folks in the camp that the crazy guy in Tent 4 had found a way to make a light bulb glow without any batteries. A few people came by to stare, whispering to each other, but most of them stayed back. They did not want to get too close to something they did not understand. In a place where you have lost everything, a little bit of magic can feel a lot like a threat. Around 10 o'clock, the foot traffic on the pedestrian path that runs alongside the bridge started to pick up. This path was used by the people who lived in the fancy high-rises across the river, the ones who wore spandex to go jogging and carried water bottles that cost more than my weekly food budget when I had a real job. I was busy trying to stabilize the magnetic field in my second bucket. I had wires running everywhere, anchored down by heavy stones and bits of duct tape. To a normal person, I looked like I was building a bomb or a very strange sculpture made of trash. I did not mind. I had a vision that went far beyond what their eyes could see. Two young men stopped on the path. They looked like they were fresh out of business school, wearing those crisp white shirts and Patagonia vests that Sterling Thorne loved so much. One of them, a guy with perfectly gelled hair and a watch that caught the sunlight like a mirror, pointed at me and started laughing. "Hey, look at this," he said, loud enough for me to hear. "It is the Wizard of Oz, but he has fallen on some really hard times." His friend joined in, pulling out a smartphone that was probably the latest model, worth $1,000 easy. "Oh man, we have to get this," he said. "This is peak city living right here. Look at the trash pile technology." I did not look up. I just kept my focus on the tiny copper screw I was turning with my thumbnail. I knew exactly what they saw. They saw a man in a dirty coat sitting in the dirt, talking to a plastic pickle bucket. They did not see the resonance frequency I was calculating in my head. They did not see the way the invisible energy from the cell tower half a mile away was starting to pool around my coils like water in a basin. To them, I was just a punchline for their social media feed. The guy with the phone started filming, walking closer to the edge of the path. "Hey, Einstein!" he shouted. "What is that supposed to be? A time machine? You going back to when you had a house?" His friend doubled over, clutching his stomach. They thought they were being hilarious. I felt a sting of heat in my cheeks, a flicker of the old Arthur Vance who would have stood up and demanded an apology. But then I looked at the phone in the kid's hand. I saw the little battery icon in the corner of the screen. I knew that the very technology he was using to record me was built on the foundations of the thermal patents I had written 10 years ago. He was using my brain to mock my body. It was a strange kind of irony. I just smiled to myself and tightened the wire. I did not need his respect. I had his energy. The video went up online that afternoon. I did not have a phone, but Sarah, the former nurse who lived 3 tents down, had an old one with a cracked screen that she used when she could find a signal. She came over to me, looking worried. "Arthur, you are on the internet," she said, holding the phone out so I could see. "Look at this." Someone had posted the video with a title like, "Crazy Bridge Guy Thinks Trash is a Battery." It already had thousands of views. The comments were exactly what you would expect. People calling me a nutcase, people making jokes about my mental health, and a few people saying the city needed to clear out the trash, meaning me and my friends. I scrolled through a few of the comments. It was a strange feeling, being famous for being a failure. One person wrote, "This is what happens when you do not stay in school, kids." I had a PhD in thermal dynamics and 2 decades of experience at the top of my field, but to the world I was just a cautionary tale. Another person said, "He is probably just hiding a battery in the bucket to trick people for spare change." I handed the phone back to Sarah and thanked her. She looked confused. "Aren't you mad?" she asked. "They are making fun of you, Arthur. They are treating you like a circus animal." I patted her hand, which was cold and rough from the wind. "Sarah, when you are building something that has never been built before, people will always laugh. They laughed at the Wright brothers, and they laughed at Tesla. They laugh because they are scared of things they can't buy in a store. Let them have their fun. It does not change the physics of what is happening in that bucket." I went back to my plywood table. I had work to do. The light bulb was just a proof of concept. I needed more power. I needed enough to run a heater, a hot plate, maybe even a small refrigerator for the camp. The mockery did not stop with that one video. Over the next few days, more people started coming by. It became a bit of a local trend to take a selfie with the bridge wizard. I became a background character in 100 different stories on people's phones. People would toss a few coins toward my table like I was a busker, laughing when the coins hit the plastic bucket with a hollow thud. I did not pick up the money. I just left it there in the dirt. I did not need their charity. I needed their discarded electronics. I was waiting for them to throw away something truly useful. One afternoon, a teenager with a skateboard stopped by. He did not laugh. He just stood there for a long time looking at the way I had wound the coils. He pointed to the aluminum foil capacitor I had made. "That is a Light-and-Jar design, isn't it?" he asked quietly. I looked up, surprised. "It is a variation of it," I said. "I am using it to smooth out the induction spikes." He nodded, his eyes bright with curiosity. My science teacher talked about those. But he said you can't get enough juice out of the air to do anything real. I smiled at him. Your teacher is right, usually. But your teacher isn't using a triple-phase resonance loop. He looked like he wanted to ask more, but his friends called out to him from the path, telling him to stop talking to the hobo. He sighed, gave me a quick nod, and skated away. That was the only moment of real connection I had with the world above the bridge for a week. The rest of it was just a blur of sneers and snickering. But I did not care. Every time someone walked by and made a joke, I just used that frustration to fuel my focus. I was getting closer. The hum from the bucket was getting louder, a deep, resonant thrum that I could feel in the soles of my feet. I was starting to pull in more than just radio waves. I was tapping into the massive magnetic field created by the high-voltage lines that fed the downtown core. It was dangerous work. If I messed up the grounding, the whole thing could turn into a lightning bolt in my hands. But I was not afraid. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me the most dangerous man in the city. I spent my nights by the light of my little bulb, drawing schematics in the dirt with a stick. I was designing the scrap siphon 2.0. It was going to be bigger, stronger, and loud enough that nobody would be able to ignore it. By the end of the week, the viral video had started to fade from the internet's short memory, replaced by a cat playing a piano or a celebrity's new haircut. The tourists and the jokers stopped coming by as much. I was left alone in the cold, which was exactly what I wanted. I had managed to scavenge a second microwave transformer and a large copper cooling coil from a discarded air conditioner. I was assembling the final pieces of the siphon when I heard a news report on Leo's battery-powered radio. The reporter's voice was tense. She was talking about a major technical crisis at Aegis Tech. It seemed that their revolutionary Vance core systems were starting to experience massive thermal runaway events. Data centers across the country were shutting down to prevent fires. The company's stock was plummeting, and the planned merger was on the verge of collapsing. The reporter mentioned that Sterling Thorne had issued a statement saying they had the situation under control, but industry experts were skeptical. They said the system was missing a key stabilization algorithm that only one man knew. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of my bucket reflecting in my eyes. I thought about Sterling Thorne sitting in his glass office, watching his empire melt down. He had my codes, he had my designs, and he had my reputation, but he did not have my soul, and he certainly did not have the secret to stopping the fire he had started. I looked at the scrap siphon, nearly complete on my table. It was a crude, ugly thing, but it was perfect. I reached out and touched the main copper lead, feeling a tiny spark of static jump to my skin. The world thought I was a joke. They thought I was a man who had lost everything. But as I heard the roar of a black limousine engine approaching the dirt path under the bridge, I realized that the joke was about to be on them. Sterling Thorne was not just losing his company. He was about to realize that the man he threw in the trash was the only one who could save him. And I was not sure if I felt like being a hero today. I just picked up my pliers and went back to work, waiting for the knock on my tent flap that I knew was coming. After all, a genius never rushes his masterpiece. High above, the city lights flickered, a tiny glitch in the grid that only I noticed. The hunger for power was growing, and I was the only one with a feast. Let them laugh a little longer. The silence that follows is always the loudest. My heart beat steady, rhythmic, and cold as the steel above me. The game was finally beginning. The glow from my little scrap-built heater was the most beautiful thing I had seen in years. It was not just the warmth, though my old bones certainly appreciated that. It was the way it changed the people around me. Sarah did not look so gray anymore, and Leo had stopped coughing so much. We were a little island of light and heat in a world that had tried to freeze us out. I spent my days refining the scrap siphon, using an old pair of binoculars I found to watch the birds and the distant city skyline, thinking about how energy flows through everything. I was peaceful, but I was not stupid. I knew that in a world run by men like Sterling Thorne, a miracle like mine would not stay a secret for long. The video of the bridge wizard had gone what the kids call viral. Millions of people had seen me sitting in the dirt with my glowing pickle bucket. Most of them just laughed and moved on to the next video, but I knew the sharks would be watching. They are always watching for something they can take, something they can wrap in a fancy box and sell back to the people it belongs to. I had been expecting a visit, and on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the video went up, a shiny black SUV pulled off the service road and onto the gravel path near our camp. The man who stepped out was not Sterling Thorne. Sterling was too important to get his shoes dirty in a place like this. Instead, he sent Marcus Vane. Marcus was Sterling's head of corporate security, a man with a jaw like a brick and eyes that reminded me of a dead fish. He was wearing a suit that cost more than all the tents in our camp combined, and he held a scented handkerchief to his nose as he walked toward my spot. He looked at the mud and the discarded tires with a look of pure disgust, as if he were walking through a sewer. He stopped a few feet from my plywood table and looked down at me. "Arthur," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "you always did have a flair for the dramatic. Living under a bridge? It is a bit much, don't you think?" I did not look up from the copper coil I was polishing. "Hello, Marcus," I said. "I see Sterling still has you running his errands. Is he too busy watching his company melt down to come and fire me in person again?" Marcus chuckled, a dry sound that had no humor in it. "Sterling is doing just fine, but he saw your little science project on the internet. He thinks it looks a lot like company property. You were an employee of Aegis Tech when you developed your thermal theories, Arthur. That means anything you build, even out of trash, belongs to us." He gestured toward the scrap siphon, which was humming quietly on the table. "We are here to collect our property and ensure you do not share any more trade secrets with the public." I finally looked up at him and smiled. It was a warm, tired smile. "Marcus, I built this out of a microwave and some speaker magnets. If Aegis Tech is claiming ownership of a plastic pickle bucket and some scrap copper, the company must be in even worse shape than the news says. This is not company property. This is physics, and physics belongs to everyone." Marcus did not like that. His face hardened, and he stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the damp earth. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Arthur. You sign a release admitting this technology was developed using Aegis Tech intellectual property, and maybe I can talk Sterling into putting you in a nice assisted living facility. Or we just take what is ours, and you can spend the rest of the winter explaining to the police why you are operating an unlicensed power generator in a public space." I stood up slowly, feeling the ache in my knees. "I am not signing anything, Marcus, and I am not giving you the siphon. You and Sterling already took my life once. You do not get to do it again." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned around and walked back to his SUV without another word. I knew it was not over. Men like that do not just walk away when they want something. I watched the dust settle as the SUV sped off, and then I turned to Leo, who had been watching from his tent. "Leo," I said, "I think we are going to have some visitors tonight. I need you to help me move some things." That night, the camp was unusually quiet. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the only sound was the constant thrum of the traffic above. I was sitting in the shadows of a large concrete pillar, wrapped in a dark blanket. I had moved the main scrap siphon, the one that actually worked, into a hidden hollow inside one of the bridge supports. In its place on my plywood table, I had put a decoy. It looked identical to the real one, with the same copper coils and the same magnets, but the internal wiring was a mess of short circuits and dead ends. Around 2 a.m, a dark van with its headlights off crept down the service road. 3 men in black hoodies climbed out. They did not talk. They moved with a professional efficiency that told me they had done this kind of work before. They headed straight for my tent. I watched from the darkness as they kicked over my crate and grabbed the decoy bucket from the table. One of them looked inside my tent, probably looking for blueprints or notes, but I had already moved everything. They were back in the van and gone in less than 3 minutes. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked over to my overturned table. I picked up my favorite brass wrench that they had knocked into the dirt and wiped it off on my sleeve. I could almost imagine Marcus and Sterling standing in a high-tech lab tomorrow morning, surrounded by engineers trying to figure out how a pickle bucket was going to save their company. They would take it apart, piece by piece, trying to find the secret sauce. They would measure the magnets and test the copper, but they would find nothing but a bunch of junk that did not work. I felt a small, sharp spark of satisfaction in my chest. Sterling Thorne thought he could just steal a man's mind the same way he stole his pension. He thought that if he had the machine, he had the power. But he did not understand that the machine was just a tool. The power was in the understanding of the resonance, the tiny specific adjustments to the frequency that I made every hour to keep the system in balance. Without me, the siphon was just a heavy bucket of trash. I looked up at the high-rise buildings in the distance, where the lights of the penthouse offices were still burning bright. I knew Sterling was up there somewhere, desperate and angry, waiting for his stolen prize to arrive. He was about to waste days, maybe weeks, trying to reverse engineer a paperweight. And while he was doing that, his Vance cores would keep failing, his investors would keep screaming, and his empire would keep crumbling. I walked over to the bridge support and pulled back the piece of corrugated metal that hid the real scrap siphon. I touched the wires and the little light bulb inside my tent flickered back to life, casting a warm golden glow over the dirt. I sat down and pulled my blanket tight. I was not even mad about the theft. In fact, I was almost looking forward to seeing the look on their faces when they realized they had been outsmarted by a man they thought was beneath their notice. As I closed my eyes to get a few hours of sleep, I realized that Marcus had made one big mistake. He had told me that they were worried about me sharing trade secrets. That gave me a very interesting idea. If Sterling wanted to play dirty, I was more than happy to show him just how much dirt I had collected over 20 years. The real battle was just beginning, and I was the only one who knew the terrain. I smiled a little, listening to the hum of the bridge, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the most powerful man in the world. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, I saw another car approaching, not an SUV, and not a van. This was something different, and the man stepping out was someone I had not seen in a very long time. My past was catching up to me, and I was not sure if it was coming to help or to finish what Sterling had started. I watched the sun crawl over the jagged teeth of the city skyline, painting the underside of the bridge in shades of bruised purple and dusty orange. Most people think of a theft as a loss, but in my world, it was the final piece of a very long and complicated puzzle. I sat on my crate, sipping a cup of lukewarm water that Sarah had brought me, and I could not help but chuckle. The decoy was gone, whisked away in a dark van to the high-tech laboratories of Aegis Tech. Sterling Thorne thought he had finally snatched the golden goose, but all he really did was put his hand into a bear trap that I'd been setting for 20 years. The man who stepped out of the old sedan at the edge of the dirt path was not a corporate shark. He was younger, with a messy head of hair and a jacket that looked like he had slept in it. It was Ben, my old junior engineer. He was the only one who had tried to look me in the eye the day I was fired, even if he was too scared to speak up back then. He walked toward me with a mix of shame and desperation on his face. He looked at my tattered tent and my plywood table, and I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. He did not see a failure. He saw a mentor who had been treated like garbage. "Arthur," he said, his voice cracking, "I am so sorry. I should have done something. I should have told them the truth about the emails. I knew you didn't do it. I knew Sterling was the one who authorized those logins." I stood up and put a hand on his shoulder. "It was okay, Ben. You had a mortgage and a career to think about. I do not hold it against you. But I have a feeling you did not come here just to apologize. What is happening inside the glass tower?" Ben took a deep breath and looked around to make sure nobody was listening. "It is a disaster, Arthur. The Vance cores are melting down. Not just one or two, but all of them. The thermal cycles are drifting out of sync, and the cooling pumps are fighting each other instead of the heat. Sterling is losing his mind. He told the board it was a minor glitch, but the big merger is supposed to happen in 48 hours. If the data centers go dark, the deal is dead, and the company will be bankrupt by Friday. I nodded, knowing exactly what was happening. I had designed those cores with a very specific safety buffer, a thermal ghost that required a manual override every few years. It was a security feature I had built in to make sure the systems were always being maintained by a human being who knew what they were doing. Sterling had fired the only person who had the key to that ghost. And then there is the device, Ben continued, his eyes widening. Marcus brought in that plastic bucket this morning. He told everyone it was a prototype you stole from the company. They have been trying to power it up for 3 hours, but every time they connect it to the grid, it just sits there. But that is not the big news. The big news is that when they logged it into the evidence locker, they had to take high-resolution photos of the internal components. I smiled, and this time it was a sharp, knowing grin. And did they see the signature, Ben? Ben nodded vigorously. I saw it, Arthur. I was the one who did the intake scan. I saw the way the copper coils are wound. It is the Vance weaver pattern. You see, my father was a weaver in a small town in Ohio. He taught me that every craftsman has a signature, a way of doing things that is as unique as a fingerprint. When I wound the coils for the scrap siphon, I used a very specific, non-standard technique that I had patented as a personal art project nearly 15 years ago. It had nothing to do with Aegis Tech or my job as a thermal engineer. It was a hobby patent, something I did for fun to protect the unique way I built my own amateur radio equipment. By stealing that bucket and logging it into their corporate inventory as company property, Sterling Thorne had just committed the ultimate legal blunder. He had officially claimed ownership of a design that was legally registered to me as an individual, years before I ever worked on the Vance core. In his greed to steal my new invention, he had accidentally provided irrefutable proof that I was the original author of the technology. More importantly, he had linked his company to my private, patented work in a way that he could never undo. I looked at Ben and pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from my pocket. It was a receipt from a pro bono legal clinic I had visited a few weeks ago. Ben, I need you to take this to a woman named Clara. She is a lawyer who specializes in intellectual property. Tell her that Aegis Tech is currently in possession of a device that contains my patented weaver coils. Tell her they are claiming it as their own. Ben took the paper, his hands trembling. Arthur, if she files an injunction based on that patent, Sterling won't just lose the merger. He could go to prison for corporate theft and fraud. He is already under investigation for the Vance core failures. This will be the nail in the coffin. I watched Ben run back to his car, his sense of purpose renewed. I felt a strange sense of peace. For months, I had been the man under the bridge, the crazy guy with the glowing bucket. I had let them laugh, let them film me, and even let them steal from me. I had played the part of the victim perfectly because I knew that a man like Sterling Thorne could never resist a chance to kick someone when they were down. He thought he was taking my last hope, but he was actually walking right into a courtroom he could not buy his way out of. Later that evening, the air turned even colder, but I did not mind. I sat by my small hidden heater and listened to the radio. The news was full of reports about the Aegis Tech crisis. The stock was in freefall, dropping 20% in a single afternoon. There were rumors of a massive lawsuit being filed by a group of investors who claimed they were misled about the stability of the Vance core. But the real blow came just as the sun went down. A reporter announced that a surprise legal filing had just been served to the Aegis Tech headquarters. A temporary restraining order had been issued, freezing all of the company's research and development assets. The reason? A claim of patent infringement and theft of private property. The reporter sounded confused, mentioning something about a handmade device built from scrap metal that was now the center of a multi-billion-dollar legal battle. I could almost see Sterling Thorne in his office, staring at that plastic bucket on his mahogany desk. I could imagine the look on his face as his lawyers explained to him that he had just stolen something that proved he was a liar. He had tried to frame me for selling secrets, but now he was the one caught red-handed with a device he could not explain. He was trapped between a failing cooling system and a legal nightmare of his own making. I looked up at the moon, which was bright and clear above the highway. The bridge felt different tonight. It did not feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a throne. I had spent 20 years building things that other people took credit for. But those days were over. The world was finally starting to realize that you cannot just throw a man away and expect his genius to disappear with him. Just as I was about to lie down for the night, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness of the camp. A sleek silver car pulled up, and a man in a very expensive suit stepped out. It was not Marcus, and it was not Sterling. It was the lead investigator for the merger, the man who was supposed to be buying Aegis Tech for billions of dollars. He looked at my tent, then at me, and he did not laugh. He looked terrified. "Mr. Vance," he asked, his voice shaking, "we need to talk about the thermal ghost in the Vance Corps, and we need to talk about what it will take for you to drop that injunction." I looked at him and smiled my warmest, most dangerous smile. "I am sorry," I said, "but I am just a crazy man living under a bridge. I do not think I have anything you want, unless of course you want to talk about the price of a man's dignity." The man looked like he was about to faint. He knew that the clock was ticking and every second that passed was costing his clients millions. But I was in no hurry. I had all the time in the world, and for the first time in a long time, the person in the dark was the one holding all the light. The corporate giant was finally looking down into the mud, and he was starting to realize that the man he saw there was the only thing standing between him and total ruin. But as he opened his mouth to make an offer, I saw another car pull up behind him. It was a police cruiser, its lights flashing red and blue. My heart skipped a beat. The trap was sprung, but I was not sure if I was the hunter or the one about to be caught in the crossfire. The police car that pulled up behind the silver limousine was not there to arrest me. I sat there on my crate, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But the officer who stepped out did not reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he opened the back door for a woman in a sharp navy blue suit. She walked straight past the panicked merger investigator and stopped in front of my plywood table. She did not look at the mud on my boots or the rust on my tools. She looked at me with a professional level of respect that I had not seen in a very long time. She handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope with a wax seal. It was an invitation to the Apex Innovation Summit, the biggest tech conference in the world, happening right downtown in 3 days. The invite was addressed to the architect of the resonance cycle. That was a title I had used in my private journals for years, something Sterling Thorne would never have known to look for. I spent the next 2 days getting ready. I did not have a tuxedo, and I did not have the money to rent one. I went to the public library and used their sink to scrub the grease from under my fingernails until my skin was raw. I used a pair of sewing scissors from Sarah's kit to trim my beard as best I could in the reflection of a darkened window. My clothes were the same ones I had been wearing for months, but I washed them in the river and let them dry over my little heater until the wrinkles were mostly gone. I looked like a man who had been through a war, but my eyes were clear. I packed the scrap siphon into a brown paper grocery bag, tucked my brass wrench into my pocket for luck, and started the long walk toward the center of the city. The hotel where the summit was being held was a palace of glass and gold. As I walked through the revolving doors, the air conditioning hit me like a physical wave. It was exactly 68 degrees, the perfect thermal balance I used to maintain at Aegis Tech. I stood in the lobby, surrounded by men in $5,000 suits and women draped in silk, and I felt like a ghost haunting a feast. The floor was polished marble, so clean I could see the reflection of my worn-out work boots. People moved away from me as I walked past, some of them crinkling their noses at the faint scent of campfire smoke that still clung to my jacket. I did not mind. I had a ticket, and I had a secret. I walked up to the registration desk. The young woman behind the counter looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. "I am sorry, sir," she said, her voice dripping with that polite tone people use for the homeless. "The delivery entrance is around the back. This area is for registered guests only." I did not say a word. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out the cream-colored invitation. I set it on the marble counter. Her eyes went wide when she saw the gold seal of the Apex Committee. She scanned the barcode and her computer made a soft, high-pitched chime. Her whole demeanor changed in a heartbeat. "Oh, I am so sorry, Mr. Vance," she stammered, her face turning a bright shade of red. "We did not realize. The director has been waiting for you. Please follow me." She led me through a set of heavy oak doors into the main ballroom. It was a massive space filled with hundreds of people. At the very front, on a raised stage, was a long table where the industry leaders were sitting. And there, right in the center, was Sterling Thorne. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. His skin was sallow, and he was sweating through his expensive shirt. He was leaning over, whispering frantically to Marcus Vane, who looked just as miserable. They were surrounded by lawyers and reporters, all of them asking the same questions about why the Vance cores were failing. Sterling kept pointing to the plastic bucket sitting on the table in front of him, the decoy he had stolen from me. He was trying to explain that this was the future of energy, but even he did not look like he believed it. I was ushered to a small waiting area behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage. A technician tried to take my grocery bag from me, offering to put it in a secure locker, but I shook my head. I kept it clutched to my chest. This bag held more than just a machine. It held my vindication. I stood there in the shadows, listening to the roar of the crowd on the other side of the curtain. The moderator, a famous tech journalist with a booming voice, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced. Today was supposed to be a day for Aegis Tech to show us the future. But as we all know, the future is currently melting down in data centers across the country. A hush fell over the room. I could hear Sterling's chair creak as he leaned forward. However, the moderator continued. "We have received word of a breakthrough. A new technology that operates on principles we thought were impossible. A technology that does not belong to a corporation, but to a single, independent mind." He paused for dramatic effect, and I felt the adrenaline surging through my veins. Please join me in welcoming the anonymous inventor behind the resonance siphon, the man who is about to show us that power belongs to the people. The curtains began to part. The light from the stage was blinding, a wall of white that made my eyes water. I took a step forward, the brown paper bag crinkling in my hand. I could hear the whispers starting as I walked into the spotlight. People were confused. They expected a young genius in a hoodie or an old professor in a lab coat. Instead, they got me. A man in a frayed jacket with dirt on his shoes and a grocery bag in his arms. I did not look at the cameras, and I did not look at the crowd. I looked straight at Sterling Thorne. The look on his face was worth every cold night I had spent under that bridge. His jaw did not just drop. It seemed to unhinge. His eyes bulged, and he gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He recognized me. He saw the man he had framed, the man he had robbed, and the man he had tried to bury, standing on the most important stage in the world. He looked at the grocery bag in my hand, and then he looked at the useless plastic bucket on the table in front of him. I could see the moment the realization hit him. He had stolen a toy, and I had kept the sun. I walked up to the podium and set the brown bag down. The sound of it hitting the wood was loud in the silent room. I reached inside and pulled out the real scrap siphon. It was ugly. It was made of a pickle bucket, old copper, and speaker magnets held together by tape and grit. I could hear a few people in the back start to snicker. I could see the reporters leaning in, their cameras clicking away. They thought it was a joke. They thought the bridge wizard had finally lost his mind on a global stage. I did not say a word. I did not need to. I just pulled the small brass wrench from my pocket and tightened the main induction lead. I felt the familiar vibration start deep in the base of the bucket. The air around the podium began to hum, a low, powerful frequency that made the water glasses on the VIP table start to ripple. I looked at the moderator, then back at Sterling, and I gave a small, tired nod. I reached out to connect the final wire, the one that would prove everything I had been saying. The world was watching, the cameras were rolling, and the man who had tried to destroy me was about to watch his entire life go up in smoke without a single flame. I touched the wire to the terminal, and the first blue spark jumped into the air. I stood there in the center of the stage, and for a long moment, I did not say anything. I just let the silence stretch out. I wanted every person in that room to really look at me. I wanted them to see the grease under my fingernails and the frayed collar of my jacket. I wanted them to see the man they usually walked past on the street without a second glance. I could feel the heat of the stage lights on my face, and it reminded me of the small fires we used to build under the bridge, just to keep our hands from freezing. Finally, I leaned into the microphone. It made a little squeak of feedback that made the people in the front row flinch. "My name is Arthur Vance," I said. My voice was a little raspy because I had not used it much lately, but it was steady. I saw a few people whisper to their neighbors. The name was familiar to them because of the news reports about the failing Vance course, but they could not wrap their heads around the fact that the man they were looking for was standing right here, looking like he had just climbed out of a dumpster. Which, to be fair, I had. I told them the truth. I did not use big, fancy words. I told them how I had spent 20 years of my life inside the walls of Aegis Tech, building the systems that kept their emails flying and their bank accounts secure. I told them about the night I was escorted out of the building with nothing but a box of my things because a man in a very expensive suit decided I was an obstacle to his profit margin. I looked right at Sterling Thorne when I said it. He was sitting frozen at the table, his face a strange shade of gray. He looked like he wanted to jump up and stop me, but the cameras were everywhere, and he knew that any move he made would look like a confession. Then I reached into the brown paper bag. I pulled out the device. I heard a ripple of laughter go through the back of the room. It was a plastic pickle bucket. It still had a little bit of the original label peeling off the side. I had wrapped it in copper wire that I had stripped from a construction site, and I had used duct tape to secure the magnets I pried out of some old car speakers. It was the ugliest thing in that beautiful ballroom. I set it down on the podium next to the shiny, chrome-plated prototype that Sterling had stolen from me. "This is the scrap siphon," I told them. I built it while I was living under the interstate bridge down by the river. I did not have a laboratory. I did not have a team of researchers or a billion-dollar budget. I had a multi-tool, some trash, and the laws of physics that Sterling Thorne forgot I had in my head. I started pointing to the parts. I explained how the transformer from a discarded microwave was the heart of the machine. I told them how the aluminum foil from a sandwich wrapper became a capacitor. I explained it simply, like I was talking to my neighbors back at the camp. I told them that the air around us is full of energy that we just let go to waste. It is like standing in the middle of a rainstorm with a bucket and complaining that you are thirsty. All I did was find a way to catch the rain. The laughter in the room started to die down. The people in the front rows were leaning forward now. They were not looking at my dirty clothes anymore. They were looking at the bucket, I explained that this was not just a way to get free power. It was a way to give dignity back to people who had been stripped of everything. I told them about Sarah and Leo and the others who were staying warm because of a piece of plastic and some copper. "Now, I want to show you something," I said. I looked over at the technician at the side of the stage. I asked him to turn off the stage lights. He looked confused, but he did it. The room went dark, except for the exit signs and the little glowing screens of 100 cell phones. In the darkness, the hum from the bucket seemed to grow louder. It was a deep, thrumming sound that you could feel in your chest. It felt like the heartbeat of the building. I reached out and connected the final wire. I did not need a battery. I did not need to plug it into the wall. A small blue spark jumped between the leads, and suddenly, a light bulb I had mounted to the top of the bucket erupted into a brilliant, steady glow. It was so bright that people had to shield their eyes, but it did not stop there. I had tuned the resonance to match the frequency of the ballroom's own lighting grid. The massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling began to flicker. One by one, they started to glow, even though the power was supposed to be cut. The energy from my bucket was jumping through the air, finding the wires in the ceiling and feeding them. The whole room began to pulse with a soft golden light that did not come from the city's power plant. It came from a pickle bucket. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on that marble floor. I saw a famous scientist in the third row stand up, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the ceiling. He knew what he was seeing was impossible according to the textbooks, but it was happening right in front of him. The awe in the room was a physical thing. It was thick and heavy. I turned back to the table where the corporate leaders were sitting. Sterling Thorne was not looking at the lights. He was looking at Marcus Vane, his head of security. Marcus was the one who had stolen the decoy. I watched the blood drain out of Marcus's face until he was as white as a sheet. He was staring at the way I had wound the copper coils on the real device. He realized, right then and there, that the design he had logged into the company's evidence locker was a direct violation of my private patents. He realized that by trying to steal my work, he had handed me the keys to his own prison cell. Sterling Thorne tried to stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a trick!" he shouted, his voice cracking and high-pitched. "He is a fraud! That technology belongs to Aegis Tech. He is using a hidden battery." I just looked at him and smiled. It was a warm, sad smile. "Sterling," I said, "you can check for batteries all you want, but while you are doing that, you might want to check with your legal team about the Weaver signature on those coils. Because according to the papers my lawyer just filed, you are currently in possession of stolen property that you claimed was your own invention. And in this room, with all these cameras watching, I do not think anyone believes you anymore." I saw the cameras turn away from me and focus on Sterling. The reporters were like sharks who had just smelled blood in the water. They started shouting questions, moving toward the stage like a wave. Sterling looked around, trapped by the very spotlight he had worked so hard to stay in. He looked small. He looked weak. And most of all, he looked finished. But as the chaos began to erupt in the ballroom, I noticed a group of men in dark suits entering through the back doors. They were not reporters, and they were not tech fans. They were carrying heavy cases, and they were moving with a purpose that made my stomach do a slow flip. I had won the battle on the stage, but I realized that the real war for the siphon was about to get much more dangerous. I reached down and gripped my brass wrench, watching them close in. The days after the big tech summit felt like waking up from a long, cold dream. The chaos of that ballroom, with the flashing lights and the shouting reporters, was replaced by the quiet, steady hum of justice moving forward. It was not a loud process, and it did not happen overnight, but it was as unstoppable as a rising tide. I spent most of those weeks in a small, sunny office that belonged to my lawyer, Clara. It was a humble place, filled with the smell of old paper and the sound of a bubbling coffee pot. but to me, it felt like a fortress. Clara was a woman who didn't care much for fancy suits or high-priced watches, but she had a mind that could take apart a corporate lie like a master clockmaker. We sat together at her wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of documents that the government had seized from Aegis Tech. The legal collapse of Sterling Thorne's empire was a beautiful thing to watch from the inside. It turns out that when you are as arrogant as Sterling, you start to believe that the rules are just suggestions. He had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight back to his mahogany desk. Clara would pull a page out of a folder, show it to me with a little smile, and say that we had just found another piece of my life. We found the internal memos where Sterling had ordered the IT department to create a backdoor into my private server. We found the receipts for the offshore bank account he had opened in my name, funded with money he had embezzled from the company's own research and development budget. It was a strange feeling to see it all laid out like that. For months, I had been the man under the bridge, the one everyone thought was a thief and a failure. Now, the truth was coming out in black and white, stamped with the seal of the federal court. The fraud was so deep and so messy that the big merger Sterling had been counting on vanished like smoke in a high wind. The investors who were supposed to buy the company for billions of dollars didn't just walk away, they ran. They filed their own lawsuits, claiming they had been lied to about the stability of the Vance core and the ownership of the technology. Sterling Thorne was not just losing his job, he was losing everything he had ever built on a foundation of lies. I remember the day of Sterling's final deposition. I didn't have to be there, but I wanted to see him one last time. I wanted him to see me, not as a victim, but as the man who was still standing after the storm had passed. The room was sterile and bright, with a long table that felt a mile wide. Sterling sat at the far end, and he looked like a shadow of the man I used to know. His expensive suit looked too big for him now, and his skin had a gray, papery quality. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the legal pad in front of him, his hands shaking so much that he had to keep them tucked under the table. When the government lawyers started asking him about the Weaver signature on the coils of the device he stole, he just closed his eyes. He knew there was no way out. The signature was my fingerprint, a piece of my soul that he had tried to claim as his own, and it was the very thing that was sending him to prison. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't because I wanted to see him suffer. It was the feeling of balance being restored. It was like a thermal cycle that had finally found its equilibrium. I watched as his lawyers whispered to him, their faces grim, and I realized that Sterling Thorne had never really understood power. He thought power was something you took from people, but real power is something you build with your own two hands. As I walked out of that room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was Arthur Vance again, and my name finally belonged to me. While the lawyers were busy tearing down Sterling's world, I was busy building a new one for my friends. I used a portion of the settlement money to buy a small, quiet apartment building on the edge of the city. It wasn't a palace, but it was clean and warm and safe. I didn't just give the units to Sarah and Leo and the others from the bridge. I gave them a stake in the place. We started a small workshop in the basement where we could build a refined version of the scrap siphon. We weren't doing it for profit. We were doing it to make sure that nobody in our city ever had to choose between eating and staying warm. Watching Leo sit in a real chair with a book in his hand, or seeing Sarah wear a clean nurse's uniform again, was worth more to me than any of the millions Sterling had tried to steal. The final day for Aegis Tech came on a Tuesday, exactly 1 year after I had been fired. I decided to walk down to the headquarters one last time. The glass tower still caught the light of the morning sun, but it looked different now. It didn't look like a temple of innovation anymore. It looked like a hollow shell. There were moving trucks lined up at the curb, just like the ones I had seen in my dreams. Workers were carrying out the fancy furniture and the expensive art that Sterling had used to decorate his ego. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as a crane was positioned in front of the main entrance. Two men in hard hats climbed up and began to unscrew the heavy brass letters that spelled out the company name. The A was the first to fall, swinging gently on a cable before being lowered into a wooden crate. I watched as the rest of the letters followed, leaving behind nothing but a series of faint, dusty outlines on the stone wall. The doors that I had walked through for 20 years were being chained shut by a man from the sheriff's office. He put a heavy padlock on the handles and slapped a bright orange notice on the glass that said the property had been seized by the court. The hum of the server rooms was gone. The building was silent, and the air inside was finally still. I turned away from the empty tower and started to walk back toward the workshop. I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than anything I had ever known. I had my dignity, I had my friends, and I had the simple joy of knowing I had done the right thing. The company was gone, the villain was defeated, and the man under the bridge had come home. But as I reached the corner, a sleek, dark car pulled up to the curb beside me. The window rolled down, and a man I had never seen before looked at me with a very serious expression. He didn't look like a lawyer or a businessman. He looked like someone who dealt in secrets. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice low and steady. "We have been monitoring the energy readings from your new workshop. You think you've solved a local problem, but you've actually tapped into something much bigger than a pickle bucket can handle. There are people who have been waiting decades for someone to find this frequency, and they aren't as easy to stop as Sterling Thorne." He handed me a small, black device that was vibrating with a frequency I had never felt before. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at the screen and realized that the energy I had been catching from the air wasn't coming from cell towers or power lines. It was coming from somewhere else entirely, and the doors I had just seen close were nothing compared to the ones that were about to open. The key felt heavy in my hand, much heavier than a small piece of brass should feel. It was the same key I had carried in my pocket for 30 years. The one I had refused to throw away even when the bank changed the locks and the sheriff told me to move along. I stood on the porch of the house on Willow Creek Lane, and for a long moment, I just watched the way the afternoon sun hit the peeling white paint of the doorframe. The yard was overgrown with weeds that reached my knees, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of grime. But to me, it looked like a palace. The settlement had been finalized 48 hours ago, and the first thing I did was buy back my own life. I slid the key into the lock. I expected it to be stuck or rusty, but it turned with a smooth, familiar click that echoed in the quiet neighborhood. When I pushed the door open, the smell of the house hit me all at once. It was a mix of old wood, dust, and a faint, lingering scent of the cinnamon candles my wife used to light every Sunday morning. It was the smell of safety. I walked into the living room, my boots sounding loud on the hardwood floors. The house was empty of furniture, the bank having auctioned off everything I owned months ago. But the walls were still there. The height of the ceiling, the way the light pooled in the corner by the fireplace, the small scratch on the baseboard where we had moved the piano 10 years ago. It was all still there. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a homeowner. I walked through the kitchen and out to the back deck. I sat down on the top step and looked at the overgrown garden. My mind went back to the bridge, to the damp cardboard and the constant roar of the interstate. It felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been a few weeks. My phone, a new one that Clara had insisted I get, started buzzing in my pocket. I looked at the screen and saw a name I recognized, an old colleague from the engineering board. He had been one of the first people to stop taking my calls when the scandal broke. Now, he was calling for the third time today. I didn't answer. I knew what he wanted. He wanted to apologize, he wanted to ask for a job, and he wanted to be close to the man who had just dismantled a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a pickle bucket. The settlement had been more money than I ever expected to see. When Clara pushed the papers across the desk and showed me the final number, I didn't feel the rush of excitement I thought I would. I just felt tired, It was enough money to buy 10 houses like this one. It was enough to retire to a private island and never think about a thermal cycle ever again. But as I sat on my back porch, I realized that the money wasn't the victory. The victory was the fact that I could sit here in the sun and not have to worry about where my next meal was coming from. I spent the afternoon walking from room to room, touching the walls and planning where the new life would go. When the sun finally went down, I went upstairs to the master bedroom. I had gone to a furniture store earlier that day and told them I needed a bed delivered immediately. I didn't care about the price, I just wanted something soft. The delivery men had looked at me funny, probably wondering why a man in a faded jacket was buying the most expensive mattress in the showroom with a cashier's check. But they did their job. They had set it up in the center of the empty room. I took off my boots and sat on the edge of the mattress. It was so soft I felt like I was floating. I laid back and pulled the new wool blanket up to my chin. For months, the only thing between me and the cold ground was a thin layer of nylon and some flattened boxes. Now, I was wrapped in warmth. The silence of the house was almost deafening. There was no wind whistling through concrete pillars, no sirens in the distance, no sounds of people coughing in the dark. It was just me and the quiet. I thought I would fall asleep instantly. But my mind kept racing. I thought about Sterling Thorne in his cell, and I thought about the men in the dark suits who were still watching my workshop. I knew the fight wasn't entirely over, but for tonight, I was allowed to be a man in a bed. I closed my eyes and slept for 12 hours straight, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes when you finally know you are home. The next morning, I met Clara at a small diner for breakfast. She looked at me and smiled, noting that I looked like I had finally gotten some rest. "We have a lot of people waiting for an answer, Arthur," she said, stirring her coffee. "The university wants you to head their new energy department. 3 different green energy firms have offered you a seat on their board, and the city wants to give you a key to the hall. Everyone wants to know what you are going to do with that settlement fund. They think you're going to start the new Aegis Tech." I took a bite of my toast and looked out the window at the people walking by. Some of them were dressed for work, looking stressed and hurried. Others looked like they were struggling, their heads down as they searched for coins in their pockets. I thought about the scrap siphon and the way it had brought light to the camp. I thought about the man in the dark car and the mystery of the energy frequency I had discovered. "I have made a decision," I told Clara. She pulled out a notepad, ready to write down the name of a new corporation or a foundation. "I am not going to start a company, and I am not taking any of those board seats. I am going to buy the old abandoned textile mill on the south side of the city, the one that has been sitting empty for 20 years. Clara paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "The mill? Why on earth would you want that old ruin?" "It is a giant pile of bricks and broken glass." I leaned forward, a little spark of the old engineer coming back into my eyes. "Because that mill has its own independent water rights and a massive underground basement that is shielded from electromagnetic interference. I am going to turn it into a free school, but not the kind they are used to. I am going to call it the Vance Institute for Scavenged Science. We are going to bring in the people that the world has thrown away, the veterans, the homeless, the ones who have been told they have no value. We are going to teach them how to build their own power, literally. We are going to take the city's trash and turn it into a grid that the big utility companies can't touch." Clara stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "You're going to spend $40 million to teach people how to build things out of garbage, Arthur? The investors will think you have gone crazy. The city will fight you on the zoning. The power companies will try to sue you for interfering with their monopoly." I laughed, and it felt good to hear the sound of it in the quiet diner. "Let them try," I said. "I have already lived under a bridge, Clara. There is nothing they can do to me that hasn't already been done. I am not interested in being a CEO. I am interested in making sure that the next Arthur Vance doesn't have to wait 20 years to find out he is powerful." I paid for the breakfast and walked out into the crisp morning air. I felt lighter than I had in decades. Everyone expected me to climb back up the corporate ladder, to put on a suit and reclaim my spot at the top of the mountain. But they didn't understand that I liked the view from the bottom much better. Down there, you can see the foundations of the world. You can see what is broken and what is worth fixing. I started walking toward the south side, my hands in my pockets, already calculating the resonance frequency of a stone building that size. As I turned the corner, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street from my house. It was the same one from the summit. The man in the dark suit was leaning against the fender, watching me. He didn't move, and he didn't say a word. He just nodded slowly, as if he were acknowledging the move I had just made on a very large chessboard. I realized then that my surprise decision hadn't just shocked the city. It had signaled something to the people who were truly in charge. They thought I was going to hide my discovery in a boardroom, but I was about to give it to the world for free. And in their world, that was the most dangerous thing a man could do. I smiled back at him and kept walking. The real work was just beginning. I am sitting here on the front porch of my old house on Willow Creek Lane, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the street. It is a quiet, warm afternoon, the kind where the only real sound is the wind moving through the oak trees and the distant, rhythmic hum of a lawnmower a few houses down. My hands are resting on my knees, and I spend a lot of time just looking at them these days. They are the same hands that used to type out complex algorithms in a climate-controlled office on the 50th floor of a skyscraper. They are the same hands that spent months digging through wet trash under a highway bridge, searching for a bit of copper or a magnet that still had some life left in it. Now, they are clean. But the calluses from the bridge are still there, and I hope they never fully go away. Those calluses are my real degree, a reminder of a lesson that no university could ever teach me. It is funny how life circles back on itself. A year ago, I thought my story was over. I thought that when Sterling Thorne took my job and my house, he had taken the very essence of who Arthur Vance was. I believed the lie that my value was tied to my title and my paycheck. I remember sitting in that fancy boardroom, looking at those fake emails, and feeling like the world was ending because a man in a silk suit told me I was a failure. I was so caught up in the prestige of the Vance Corps and the reputation of Aegis Tech that I forgot where the real power came from. I forgot that the machines didn't make the man made the machines. When I was living under that bridge, I had a lot of time to think. At first, I was angry. I would sit in the dark and replay every moment of that final meeting, thinking of all the things I should have said and all the ways I could have fought back. But as the weeks turned into months, and the cold started to settle into my bones, the anger turned into something else. It turned into clarity. I looked around at the people in the camp, people like Leo and Sarah, and I realized that they were the most resourceful engineers I had ever met. They knew how to make a meal out of nothing. They knew how to stay warm with just a few scraps of cardboard and a little bit of ingenuity. They didn't have high-tech labs or million-dollar budgets, but they had a will to survive that was more powerful than any server farm I had ever designed. That was when the idea for the scrap siphon really took root. It wasn't just about the physics of resonance induction, though that was the part my brain loved to chew on. It was about the idea that there is energy everywhere if you just know how to look for it. The world is full of waste, wasted power, wasted materials, and most of all, wasted people. Sterling Thorne looked at a dumpster and saw trash. He looked at a homeless man and saw a ghost. But I started looking at those things and seeing a gold mine. I realized that the most sophisticated technology in the world doesn't require a clean room or a corporate badge. It just requires a problem that needs solving and the heart to see it through. I think back to that night when the first light bulb flickered to life in my tent. It wasn't the brightest light I had ever seen, but it was the most important. In that moment, I wasn't an ex-employee or a victim or a vagrant. I was a creator again. I felt a surge of joy that I hadn't felt in 20 years at Aegis Tech. In the corporate world, everything is about the next quarter or the next merger. It is all so fast and so cold. But under that bridge, every little win felt like a miracle. When I saw the faces of my neighbors as they felt the heat from my scrap-built heater, I realized that I had found a purpose that was much bigger than a patent. I had found a way to use my mind to actually help people, not just to make a billionaire even wealthier. The day of the summit, when I stood on that stage in my dirty jacket, I felt like I was finally seeing the world for what it really was. I looked out at all those people in their expensive clothes, and I realized they were the ones who were actually in the dark. They were so dependent on their systems and their structures that they wouldn't know what to do if the lights went out. They thought they were the masters of the universe. But they were just passengers. Sterling Thorne was the biggest passenger of all. He had spent his whole life trying to own things he didn't understand. He thought that by stealing my bucket, he was stealing my genius. He didn't realize that the genius wasn't in the plastic or the wire. It was in the struggle. It was in the cold nights and the bloody knuckles and the refusal to give up. Now, as I sit here on my porch, I feel a deep sense of peace. The money from the settlement is nice, and it is a relief to know that my friends from the bridge will never have to worry about a roof over their heads again. But the real gift was the realization that I am bulletproof. They can take my house, they can take my money, and they can even take my name, but they can never take what is inside my head. I have seen the bottom of the world, and I found out that I could build a ladder out of trash. That is a kind of freedom that most people will never know. I spend my mornings at the old textile mill now. We are still cleaning out the cobwebs and fixing the broken windows, but the energy in that building is incredible. We have veterans and single mothers and people who have been told their whole lives that they don't matter, and we are showing them how to build their own future. We aren't building Vance cores or corporate empires. We are building self-reliance. We are taking the things the city throws away and turning them into something beautiful. Every time a student's eyes light up because they finally understand how to catch the energy in the air, I feel like I am winning all over again. I sometimes think about Sterling Thorne. I heard he is spending his days in a gray room, staring at a concrete wall. I don't hate him anymore. In a strange way, I almost want to thank him. If he hadn't been so greedy and so cruel, I might have spent the rest of my life in that 50-story cage, never knowing what I was truly capable of. He tried to bury me, but he didn't realize I was a seed. He thought he was throwing me into the darkness, but he was actually giving me the perfect place to grow. He taught me that the most valuable things in life aren't the things you can buy or sell. They are the things you carry with you, no matter where you end up. I look down the street and see the sun beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. The neighborhood is starting to wake up as people come home from work. They pull into their driveways, walk into their warm houses, and flip on their light switches without a second thought. They don't know me, and they don't know the story of the man who lived under the bridge, and that is perfectly fine. I don't need the fame, and I certainly don't need the spotlight. I have my house, I have my health, and I have a workshop full of people who are learning how to change their own lives. I reach into my pocket and feel the cold steel of my old brass wrench. It is a simple tool, but it has been with me through everything. It was there on my first day at Aegis, and it was there on my last night under the bridge. It reminds me that as long as you have the right tools and the right mindset, you can survive anything. I have learned that genius doesn't belong to the people with the biggest offices or the fanciest titles. It belongs to anyone who is willing to look at a problem and refuse to walk away. It belongs to the dreamers who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. I look at the glowing lights of the city in the distance, and I smile to myself, knowing that the most powerful ideas are often found in the places where no one is looking. Because at the end of the day, the truth is simple. Innovation doesn't have an address.